movies.
Excuse me?
Well, of course I want to live in the past. It was better there.
It all started with the pot. You think it was the pot?
I don't think pot can do that, baby.
Didn't want to upset you.
Who's upset?
You gonna cry for help?
Would it do any good?
No.
I didn't hear you over the big machine that was gonna rip you into little
Years,
pieces.
and I got a bottle of wine called Anwar's Baby Duck.
He was a funny one, the sarcastic one, the friend who could turn almost any uncomfortable moment into a joke.
Excuse me? Not to interrupt or anything, but you were gonna kill me? That was the plan?
For 10 seasons, millions of people invited Matthew Perry into their homes. And when Chandler Bing walked into the room, we knew what was coming. Laughter. But there was something those audiences couldn't see.
Able to live.
Stand there, look at the picture of the glory days, wonder what might have been.
While
Seems to me
Chandler
you-
Bing was becoming one of the most beloved characters on television, Matthew Perry was fighting a battle that would follow him for much of his life. At the height of Friends, he had almost everything he'd once dreamed about: fame, money, success, friends, and millions of people who adored him. Yet none of it could protect him from what was happening when the cameras stopped.
Seems to me you guys are living in the past.
Well, of course I want to live in the past. It was
Matthew
better
would
there.
spend years battling addiction, recovering, relapsing, trying again and again, sometimes simply trying to survive. But this isn't a story about how Matthew Perry died. It's about how he tried to live. Because toward the end of his life, Matthew said something
Of
remarkable.
normalcy.
I see your lips moving and I hear you talking, but it just doesn't feel real to me.
I don't feel real to you?
When his time eventually came, he did want Friends to be the first thing people remembered. Not Chandler, not the jokes, not the fame. He wanted people to remember that he tried to help.
This all started with the pot. You think it was the pot?
I don't think pot can do that, baby.
And after his death at just 54 years old, those words became impossible to forget, because behind one of television's most famous smiles was a man who knew exactly what it felt like to desperately need someone. And perhaps Matthew Perry's greatest legacy wasn't making millions of people laugh. It was trying to make sure someone else didn't have to struggle alone.
I really didn't want to upset you.
Who's upset? I'm just...
This is Matthew Perry, behind the smile, before Chandler Bing, before Friends, before millions of people knew his name. Matthew Perry was a kid trying to figure out where he
Neighbors
belonged.
past.
Aren't you gonna cry for help?
Would it do any good?
No.
He was
Who are
born
you?
on August 19, 1969, in Williamstown, Massachusetts. His mother, Suzanne, was Canadian. His father, John Bennett Perry, was an American actor and model. But when Matthew was still a baby, his parents separated. Matthew moved with his mother to Ottawa, Canada, while his father remained in the United States.
Who are you?
Franklin Figueroa, a.k.a. Frankie Figs. I work for Yanni Gogolak.
Oh my God.
Years later, Matthew would write openly about how deeply those early experiences affected him. Beneath the confidence, beneath the humor, there was a young boy who often struggled with feelings of loneliness and with the fear of being left behind.
Me? Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't hear you over the big machine that was gonna rip you into little pieces.
But Matthew discovered something early. He could make people laugh. And laughter did something extraordinary. It connected him to people. A joke could change the atmosphere of a room. A funny comment could make someone notice him. Humor became more than something Matthew was good at. It became part of the way he connected with the
Mr.
world.
Gogolak, I don't know where Jimmy is. Gogolak, please, as far as I know, he's dead.
Comedy wasn't his only talent. Growing up in Canada, Matthew became an exceptional tennis player. He competed seriously as a junior, and for a time, tennis looked like it might become his future. Then as a teenager, Matthew moved to Los Angeles to live with his father. And almost immediately, the world around him changed.
That's Kevin Conroy.
The tennis player from Ottawa was now surrounded by Hollywood. Auditions, television sets, actors, possibility. Matthew began acting professionally, picking up smaller roles while trying to establish himself.
You're the man. That's Kevin Cartwright.
There were appearances in television shows, failed projects, pilots that went nowhere, and all the uncertainty that comes with trying to make a living as an actor. But there was something Matthew possessed that couldn't easily be taught. Timing. He understood exactly when to pause, when to react, when to throw away a line, and when to use humor to make an uncomfortable moment disappear.
Mika Wallace, you earned perfect scores.
Years before the world met Chandler Bing, the ingredients were already there. The sarcasm, the insecurity, the lightning-fast wit, and underneath it all, a desire to be liked, to belong, to make people laugh, and perhaps to make sure they stay.
You know, what it's all about is helping people, and I've heard already 5 stories of people that read the book and checked into treatment.
Matthew couldn't have known it yet, but somewhere in Hollywood, a character was being created who would fit him almost perfectly. A character who used humor when things became uncomfortable. A character who desperately wanted connection, but didn't always know how to ask for it. His name was Chandler Bing. And when Matthew Perry walked into that role, his entire life was about to change.
Well, I mean, that was pretty heavy. I was with my best friends, the Murray brothers, and...
In 1994, Matthew Perry was still waiting for the role that would change his life. He had worked, he had auditioned, he had appeared on television, but Hollywood hadn't quite figured out what to do with him. Then, a script came along about 6 young friends living in New York City. The show was originally developed under a different title, but eventually, the world would know it simply as Friends.
We decided, we didn't know what we were doing, you know, and they got some beers, and I got a bottle of wine called Anwar's Baby Duck.
There was one character Matthew immediately understood. Chandler Bing. Smart, awkward, insecure, and very, very funny. Chandler didn't always know what to say when life became uncomfortable, so he made a joke. For Matthew, that felt familiar. He understood Chandler's rhythm, his sarcasm, his vulnerability, his desperate need to turn uncomfortable moments into laughter.
And lay in the ground and looked at the skies and just felt better than I ever had in my entire life. And I thought
Matthew
to myself,
didn't simply play Chandler Bing. He helped shape him. The unusual emphasis, the pauses, the reactions, the perfectly timed sarcasm. Even the way Chandler could make an ordinary sentence sound ridiculous became unmistakably Matthew Perry.
life. And I thought to myself, this is probably what normal people feel like all the time.
Then, on September 22nd, 1994, Friends premiered. Nobody involved could have known what was about to happen. Jennifer Aniston, Courtney Cox, Lisa Kudrow, Matt LeBlanc, David Schwimmer, and Matthew Perry. 6 actors who were about to become 6 of the most recognizable faces on television.
People who just walked the face of the earth, people. And I finally felt at home for the very first time. As soon as I drank alcohol,
Friends became a phenomenon. Millions watched every week. Hairstyles became trends. Catchphrases entered everyday conversation. Central Perk became one of television's most recognizable locations. And Chandler Bing became one of the show's most beloved characters.
alcohol. I just loved it, and I had a much different reaction than the Murrays did, and I had a much different reaction than normal people have.
Matthew
Normal
had
people-
finally made it, really made it. The struggling young actor was suddenly famous around the world. Money followed, magazine covers, awards, enormous ratings. Eventually, the 6 stars negotiated together and became some of the highest paid actors in television history. This was everything Matthew had wanted: to succeed, to belong, to make people laugh. And now, tens of millions of people were
3
laughing with
weeks,
him.
the life seems to make sense. And why would you not want to drink if that happened to you all the time, you know?
But fame brought something else. Pressure. Matthew became intensely aware of whether audiences laughed at his jokes. He would later describe how desperately he wanted those laughs. If a joke didn't land, it could affect him deeply. The laughter that had once helped a young Matthew connect with people had become something he increasingly depended upon. And then, away from the cameras, another problem was growing. In 1997, Matthew was injured in a jet ski accident. He was prescribed the painkiller Vicodin. What began with medication after an injury became part of a much larger struggle with addiction. And suddenly, there were 2 Matthew Perrys. There was the Matthew millions of people saw every week. Quick, funny, successful, surrounded by friends. And there was the Matthew who went home when filming ended, struggling, frightened, and increasingly dependent on substances he would spend years trying to escape. That's the cruel contradiction. at the center of Matthew Perry's story. At the exact moment the world believed he had everything, Matthew was beginning to lose control. Every week, Chandler Bing made millions of people laugh. But when the cameras stopped, Matthew Perry was entering a fight that no punchline could fix. As Friends became bigger, Matthew Perry's private battle became harder to hide. On television, Chandler Bing was thriving. He had the jokes, the apartment, the friends, eventually, the love story with Monica. To millions of viewers, Chandler's life was moving forward. Matthew's was becoming increasingly complicated. What had begun with prescription painkillers after an accident developed into a much deeper struggle. Alcohol, prescription medication, addiction, recovery, relapse, and then trying to recover all over again. Matthew would later speak with extraordinary openness about those years. He wasn't interested in pretending they hadn't happened. He wanted people to understand just how powerful addiction could become. And perhaps one of the saddest parts of his story is that much of it unfolded while the world was watching him every week. Viewers began noticing changes in Matthew's appearance. His weight could fluctuate dramatically, but few understood what was happening behind the scenes. Matthew later explained that his changing appearance could reflect different periods of his struggle. There were times when he entered treatment and times when he returned to work. Sometimes, the distance between those two worlds was frighteningly small. Imagine that contradiction. You walk onto one of the most famous television sets in the world. The lights come on, the cameras roll, an audience is waiting. Your job is to be funny. And Matthew was brilliant at it. He could deliver a line, pause, make an expression, and send the room into laughter. Then someone called cut, and the laughter stopped. The character disappeared. But Matthew's problems didn't. Years later, he revealed something particularly heartbreaking. There were entire stretches of Friends that he struggled to remember filming. 10 seasons, more than 200 episodes, one of the most successful television shows ever made. And some of those memories were clouded by addiction. His castmates knew he was struggling. They cared about him. They tried to support him. But addiction doesn't disappear simply because people love you. It doesn't care how successful you are, how much money you have, how famous you become, or how desperately the people around you want you to get better. Matthew would enter rehabilitation more than once. There would be periods of sobriety, followed by periods when the struggle returned. And yet, he kept showing up, kept working, kept performing, kept making people laugh. In 2004, Friends finally came to an end. For 10 years, Chandler Bing had been one of the most recognizable characters in the world. The final episode was watched by more than 50 million people in the United States alone. For the audience, it was goodbye to 6 fictional friends. For Matthew, it meant something else. The place where he'd spent a decade, the people he'd worked beside, the character that had changed his life, were suddenly no longer part of his everyday routine. But the battle he'd been fighting came with him, and over the years that followed, it would take Matthew Perry frighteningly close to death, more than once. Yet this is where his story begins to change. Because, eventually, Matthew stopped asking only, "How do I save myself?" and began asking something else. How can what happened to me help save somebody else? Matthew Perry had spent years making people laugh. Now, he was trying to stay alive. And recovery wasn't a straight line. There were periods when Matthew was doing well. Periods when he believed the worst was finally behind him. And then there were relapses, treatment, another attempt, another beginning. Matthew would later describe addiction not as something he had simply chosen, but as something that had taken control of enormous parts of his life. And the consequences were becoming increasingly serious. In 2018, Matthew suffered a gastrointestinal perforation. His condition became critical. He spent months in hospital and underwent numerous surgeries. He later revealed just how close he'd come to dying. His body had endured years of punishment, but somehow Matthew survived. Again, and perhaps experiences like these began changing the way he understood his own struggle. Because somewhere along the journey, recovery stopped being only about Matthew Perry. He realized that there was something he possessed that could actually help another person experience. Matthew knew what addiction felt like. He knew what relapse felt like. He knew the shame, the promises, the fear, the exhaustion of starting again. And he knew something else. When you're trapped inside addiction, sometimes the person you trust most is someone who has already been there. So Matthew began speaking, publicly, honestly, Without pretending that recovery was easy, he advocated for people struggling with addiction. He supported recovery programs, and he tried to turn his own experience into something that could help someone else. In 2013, Matthew received an award from the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, recognizing his advocacy for treatment and recovery. Think about the transformation in that. The thing that caused Matthew so much pain was becoming the very thing that allowed him to understand the pain of others. He couldn't erase his past. He couldn't get those years back. But perhaps he could give them meaning. Matthew also turned his former Malibu home into Perry House, a sober living facility designed to help men in recovery. This wasn't Chandler Bing making people laugh. There was no studio audience, no applause sign, no punchline. This was Matthew Perry trying to use the darkest part of his own life to become a light in somebody else's. And there's something incredibly important about that. Matthew wasn't presenting himself as someone who had conquered everything. His own struggle continued. There would still be difficult periods, still battles, still mistakes, still attempts to begin again. But perhaps that made his desire to help even more meaningful, because he understood recovery from the inside. He understood that sometimes getting better doesn't mean never falling again. Sometimes it simply means refusing to stop trying to stand back up. Then Matthew decided to tell the whole story, not Chandler's story. In 2022, he released his memoir, Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing. And suddenly, millions of people who thought they knew Matthew Perry discovered just how much had been happening behind the smile. He wrote about fame, relationships, addiction, recovery, near-death experiences, and the enormous contradiction of having almost everything while repeatedly coming close to losing it all. But among everything Matthew said during that period, one idea stands above the rest. In one of his final major interviews, Matthew explained how he hoped people would remember him. Of course, he knew Friends would always be part of his legacy. How could it not be? Chandler Bing had brought laughter to hundreds of millions of people. But Matthew wanted something else mentioned first: helping people. He wanted it remembered that when someone struggling with alcohol or drugs came to him and asked for help, he wanted to help them. Suddenly, the story of Matthew Perry looks different. The addiction wasn't his legacy. The relapses weren't his legacy. Even Chandler Bing wasn't the legacy he wanted most. Matthew wanted the worst thing that had happened to him, to become something useful. He couldn't change what addiction had taken from his life, but maybe he could use what remained to stop it taking someone else's. And Matthew couldn't have known it, but when he spoke about how he wanted to be remembered, he was telling the world how to tell his story, before anyone realized how soon they would have to. By 2022, Matthew Perry was finally telling his story, in his own words. For decades, millions of people had known his face. They knew Chandler Bing. They knew the sarcasm, the awkward smile, the perfectly timed jokes. But now, Matthew wanted them to know the man behind all of it. His memoir was brutally revealing, sometimes funny, sometimes uncomfortable, sometimes heartbreaking. He didn't present himself as a hero, and he didn't pretend he'd made all the right choices. Instead, he showed people just how complicated addiction could be, how someone could desperately want to stop and still struggle, how someone could have every reason in the world to be happy and still be hurting, how fame could open almost every door imaginable while leaving the most important battles untouched. Matthew estimated that over the course of his struggle, he had spent millions of dollars trying to get sober, years of treatment, rehabilitation, therapy, recovery, relapse, and starting again. Yet when Matthew spoke about those experiences, something interesting happened. He increasingly talked less about what addiction had taken from him, and more about what his experience might allow him to give. He knew he would always be Chandler Bing. There was no escaping that. Somewhere in the world, almost every day, someone was watching Friends. Someone was hearing one of Chandler's jokes for the first time. Someone was laughing because of Matthew Perry. And Matthew was proud of that, but he wanted his life to mean more. During an interview in 2022, he spoke about how he hoped he would eventually be remembered. His message was remarkably clear. When someone struggling with addiction came to him, he wanted to help. And when his life was eventually discussed, he hoped that part would come before Friends. Think about what he was saying. Matthew Perry had achieved something millions of actors dream about. He had helped create a character that would probably outlive him. Chandler Bing had become part of popular culture. Yet, Matthew was telling us, The thing he was most famous for wasn't necessarily the thing he was most proud of. He wanted to be remembered for reaching toward someone who was struggling the way he had struggled. Maybe that's because Matthew understood something fame couldn't teach him. Sometimes, changing one person's life matters more than entertaining millions. And then, less than a year after his memoir had introduced the world to this very different Matthew Perry, came October 28th. Matthew was found unresponsive in the hot tub at his Los Angeles home. He was 54 years old. News of his death traveled around the world almost immediately. For millions of people, it didn't feel like the death of a distant celebrity. It felt strangely personal, because Matthew Perry had been inside their home for years. Chandler had been there after school, after work, during breakups, during lonely nights, during difficult times. Friends had become comfort television, and Matthew had been one of the people providing that comfort. His 5 Friends co-stars released a joint statement, describing themselves as more than castmates. They were a family. Around the world, fans returned to old episodes, old interviews, old jokes, and once again, Matthew Perry was making people laugh. Except now, the laughter felt different, because behind every joke was the knowledge that the person delivering it was gone. The medical investigation would later reveal that Matthew's death was more complicated than many initially understood. His death was ruled accidental, with the acute effect of ketamine listed as the primary cause, with drowning, coronary artery disease, and the effects of buprenorphine also contributing. Further investigations into how Matthew obtained the ketamine would continue after his death, but those circumstances shouldn't be allowed to become his entire story, because Matthew Perry had already told us how he hoped the story would end. Not with addiction, not with a hot tub, not even with Chandler Bing, but with the people he tried to help. And maybe when someone tells us how they hope to be remembered, we should listen. Matthew Perry spent much of his life making people laugh. And the strange thing is, he still does. Somewhere tonight, someone will turn on Friends. Maybe they've seen the episode 100 times. Maybe they're watching it for the first time. Chandler Bing will walk into the room, deliver a perfectly timed line, and somebody will laugh. That's an extraordinary legacy, to create something that continues bringing joy even after you're gone. But Matthew Perry asked us not to make that his entire story, because behind Chandler Bing, there was Matthew, and Matthew's life wasn't a sitcom. There was no script telling him what happened next, no writers waiting with the perfect punchline, no audience laughing when things became uncomfortable. There was simply a man trying desperately to overcome something that had taken enormous pieces of his life. Sometimes he succeeded, sometimes he didn't, sometimes he fell, after believing he'd finally found his footing, and then he tried again. Maybe that's important, because it's tempting to tell stories like Matthew's as though life divides neatly into 2 groups: people who overcome their struggles and people who don't. Real life is rarely that simple. Matthew's journey was complicated. Recovery was complicated. Matthew was complicated. He could be enormously successful and deeply unhappy, surrounded by people and still feel alone, brilliantly funny while experiencing tremendous pain. None of those things cancel the others out. They simply make him human. And perhaps that's what makes a story resonate. Because behind every celebrity we think we know, there's a life we don't see. Behind every photograph, every interview, every joke, there can be another story unfolding completely out of view. Matthew understood that better than most. And eventually, he tried to turn that understanding into something useful. He spoke about addiction. He advocated for recovery. He opened his door to people who needed help. And he made it clear that this was a part of his life he hoped would matter. Matthew couldn't save everyone. And ultimately, he couldn't escape every struggle of his own. But maybe legacy isn't about having a perfect ending. Maybe it's about what you try to give while you were here. The world will always remember Chandler Bing. The sarcasm, the awkwardness, the smile, the jokes, and we should. Matthew Perry gave millions of people something incredibly valuable: laughter. But if we remember only Chandler, perhaps we missed the most important part of Matthew's story. Because when someone struggling with addiction came to him, Matthew wanted to help. He knew what that person was feeling. He knew the fear. He knew the shame. He knew what it meant to fall and wonder whether you had enough strength left to stand again. And he wanted that person to know they weren't facing it alone. So perhaps Matthew Perry should be remembered exactly the way he asked us to remember him. Yes, as the man who made us laugh, but also as the man who understood what it meant to hurt. Behind the smile, there was pain, but behind the pain, there was purpose, and perhaps that was Matthew Perry's most important role of all.